Hello, broken promises, house building and a blockbuster star. A busy morning after a grisly week. This hasn't been Westminster's finest week.
From someone who's broken every single promise he was elected on.
An ugly spat in the Commons.
Defining a woman. Although in fairness, that was only 99% of a U-turn.
Of all the weeks to say that, when Brianna's mother is in this chamber, shame.
Such a clash with the courage and compassion of Brianna Jai's mum campaigning for young people. A broken promise from Labour. No more the target of spending $28 billion a year to go green for future generations.
It's economically illiterate, it's environmentally irresponsible, and it's politically jejune.
And a surge in evictions. The government not yet keeping its vows on housing. Harder than ever to get a roof over your head if you're starting out.
The landlord wanted to get their property back. I wouldn't wish this situation on anybody.
So we're asking this morning, are our politicians listening to the concerns of the young? So what are the Tories really doing for the next generation? Michael Gove is here. How can Labour boast about its green plans without the big price tag? Its campaign chief, Pat McFadden, joins us too. And as if there wasn't enough drama in politics, megastar Ray Fiennes is here. Bond's M, Lord Voldemort, and now Macbeth.
Is this a dagger which I see before me?
Morning, morning. My trio to chat through the next 60 minutes at the desk with me, the historian Simon Schama, the editor of The Sun, Victoria Newton, and the housing campaigner, Kweja Tweneboa. A very warm welcome to all of you, and a very warm welcome to you too. Let's start with the headlines and what's making the news this morning. Lots of the front pages have King Charles's gratitude for the public support since his cancer diagnosis. The Mail on Sunday has a different take, claiming books have been written by artificial intelligence about his illness. The Sunday Times splashes with our guest this morning, Michael Gove, who's claiming young people might turn away from democracy if they don't get the houses they need. And with two by-elections this week, some Tory MPs have told The Observer that their party has already surrendered to Labour. But the BBC website is featuring the Foreign Secretary David Cameron's warning to Israel against its planned offensive in Rafah, where much of Gaza's population is sheltering. Let's start with that story. Simon, there is a sense that people are holding their breath. We think more than 1 million people are sheltering in Rafah, but the Israelis seem intent on a big offensive there.
Yes, Laura, it is a cliff-face moment, really. Look, we're talking about two absolutely traumatized populations. The Israelis, on the one hand, who are increasingly desperate to have the hostages back, and the terrible suffering that Gaza Palestinians have gone through. We're told by Gershom Baskin, I have to cite his name as a political activist with very, very good sources, also a journalist, that the issue now with Rafah in particular is that the IDF, the Israeli army, suspects there are tunnels very close to Rafah. And the Egyptians say, no, we've tested that, and we've gone 6 meters down, 6 kilometers, not 6 meters down, and there aren't. And the Israelis are very skeptical of that. The issue for Israel now is really a discussion with Egypt. As you say, 1.7 million, more than half of an incredibly suffering Gazan Palestinian population is there, and Egypt does not want a huge flow on its side.
And there are so many different competing factors, Victoria, but I think a lot of people in this country sort of look on just with horror, not sure what to think. What are your readers making of what's happening?
They just want it to stop. They want aid to get in and to get the people out. They haven't particularly taken a strong side either way, but they just want the violence to stop.
Now, we're going to talk to Michael Gove in a second. Kwejo, you've been campaigning hard on housing for a long time. Just give us a sense of how the picture looks to you.
I mean, it's absolutely bleak, and I think only getting worse. More and more people are struggling, and we know where this housing crisis stems from. It stems from the rental sector. We know the majority of people now in the UK are renting, but we also know, we have seen the statistics in the last few days in regards to the no-fault evictions, 30,000 handed out. We also know that we've got some of the highest rents in Europe, and we also know on top of that, that now, today, especially in places like London, people are spending, I'd say, on average about 40 to 50% of their income, in some cases more, on privately rented in comparison to the 1980s, where it was only 20 to 30%. And it's even bleaker in the social housing sector at the moment. OK, well, plenty to get into with Michael Gove, which we'll do in a second. But first of all, let's go back in time. Have a listen to this lot.
The dream of a property-owning democracy is alive, and we will help you fulfil it.
Reigniting home ownership in Britain once again.
We will enable more young people everywhere to share the dream of home ownership, the great ambition of the human race.
Now, that dream has become a housing nightmare for too many people, as Kwejo was just telling us. The Housing Secretary, Michael Gove, is with us this morning. Welcome to you. You said yourself, not long ago, the system is broken. But let's start by giving the audience a real picture of what is going on with some statistics. So let's have a look at this. You can see there how much the prospect of owning your own home has changed. Earnings have doubled since 1997. House prices have increased 4.5 times, a huge, huge change. Then 10 years ago, if we look at our next graphic, we can show people the kind of impact that has had on social housing. Social housing, 180,000 of them have been lost since between 2012 and 2022, while the Conservatives have been in charge. That has resulted in such huge pressure being put on. If we look at the next set of statistics, that has meant we've got more and more evictions. Just last year, 6,003, just over 6,000 in 2022, rather. Last year, a significant increase to more than 9,000 people losing their rented homes when they had done nothing wrong, those so-called no-fault evictions. And the knock-on from that to temporary accommodation, where people end up, is a huge increase. You can see there, 2013, not long after the Conservatives had taken charge, 55,000. Now, 2023, more than 100,000 people in temporary accommodation. Now, Michael Gove, looking at that picture, it is bleak. You yourself said the system is broken. So who broke it?
Well, all of the areas which you've drawn attention to are areas where we are taking action now. So we're taking action to increase the supply of homes overall. And it's important to stress that there have been 2.5 million homes built since 2010. And that if you look over the last 30 years, the 4 years with the highest number of new homes have been since 2019.
But who broke the system?
Well, there are a variety of different factors that have driven the challenges that we face. One is being the pressure, particularly in our cities, sometimes as a result of overseas investment, but certainly as a result of population growth. The other thing has been the need to ensure that we have a pipeline of new homes, and that's why we're taking action this week, and we already have been in preceding months, to increase the supply, particularly in our cities, where the demand is greatest. And then a third factor, which I think is important to bear in mind as well, is access to mortgage finance. And in the wake of the 2008 financial crash, for entirely understandable reasons, the rules were tightened up on lending overall, and that's had an impact on people's capacity to buy. But briefly, there were two other things you mentioned there. Social homes, critically important, and the private rented sector, where we're taking action on both.
So you've identified then a growing population, yes, not enough being built, and a squeeze on mortgage finance, yes, as the reasons. We'll talk later about perhaps whether the people who've been in charge for so long, presiding over all of this, might have some responsibility too.
Oh, of course.
Let's look at then one of the specifics. You promised in 2019 in your manifesto that you were going to get rid of what's called Section 21, where landlords can evict tenants for no reason.
Yes.
It hasn't happened yet. Can you guarantee the 11 million renters in this country that you will end this before the general election?
Yes, we have a bill. It's gone through its stages in the House of Commons, and that bill does a number of things to help people in the private rented sector, including ending no-fault evictions. Why does that matter, some might ask? Well, it is the case that there are a small minority of unscrupulous landlords who use the threat of eviction either to jack up rents or to silence people who are complaining about the quality of their homes. It's important that we deal with that abuse because the vast majority of landlords do a great job, and you need a healthy private rented sector as part of a balanced housing economy.
You are explicitly saying this morning that practice will be banned. It will not be allowed to happen before the next general election.
That's what it says in the bill. The bill ends Section 21.
But there's a different factor here, because previously you've said, well, the courts might not be able to cope, so we might bring in the new law, but it actually might still happen because the courts aren't ready. So I ask you again, just to be really explicit, will this practice have ended by the time of the next general election?
We will have outlawed it, and we will have put the money into the courts in order to ensure that they can enforce that.
OK, that's very explicit there, and we've got that on the record. Let's then talk about the huge rise of the number of people in temporary housing. We've shown that to our viewers this morning. It's really, really stark. Is it acceptable to have that many people in temporary accommodation in one of the richest countries in the world?
No, it's not, and that's why we're taking action. So we have introduced something called the Local Authority Housing Fund, which is money that central government gives to councils specifically to acquire new properties to help to deal with this challenge. And also this week, we're extending loans to housing associations, the people who provide homes for social rent, in order to ensure that there can be at least another 20,000 new social homes there. That's on top of the £11.5 billion in the Affordable Homes Programme, which is grant money that goes direct to local authorities and housing associations to provide more homes.
Can you commit today that you will have got the numbers of people in temporary accommodation down before the election?
No, I can't. I'm determined that we should do so, but the pressures, some of which we mentioned earlier, are significant. So we are absolutely determined to do everything we can, but it's a big issue, and it's an issue which is also driven by, as we mentioned earlier, two things. One is the flow of population changes in our country, and there are a variety of different population changes. And then the second thing is the tough circumstances that people who are facing economic difficulties face in this country. And that's why it's vitally important that we stick to our economic plan, which will ensure not just that the tax burden is lowered, but also that we continue to provide support for those most in need.
Some people might say it was also vitally important that you would stick to your plan by actually having the same people in charge of it. I mean, there have been 16 housing ministers in a short succession of years. It is impossible to imagine that that has not been part of the problem here, is that simply the government hasn't focused enough on this issue and hasn't gripped it.
Well, I think that that is a category error. Because actually, if you look at the way in which policy has been delivered, then, as I mentioned, we have are on the verge of announcing 1 million homes, additional homes, having been built since 2019. It is the case that if you look at, as I mentioned, over the last 3 decades, the 4 years with the biggest number of new homes have been since 2019.
Forgive me, Secretary of State, 1 million homes in 5 years is running less than your target, which is 300,000 homes a year. But I want
But your argument is, has the change of individual in one role affected the trajectory?
And actually, you say not?
No.
Okay.
So my position and the government's position, I hope, is clear, which is we've managed to deliver more homes than our predecessors. But we're not patting ourselves on the back. It's just important, though, to put that out there. What we're saying is that we do need to go further. So it is an honest admission of the scale of the problem, but also an honest acknowledgement that we have managed to increase the number of homes. We need to do more.
And the population has been increasing.
Yes.
And the numbers of people waiting for social housing, which we would have called council housing in years gone by, has gone up and up and up. And these just aren't numbers. These are people whose lives feel like they're on hold. They are stuck. One of our viewers, Shan, wants you to explain to her why she has been stuck on a waiting list along with more than 1 million other people for social housing and stuck in temporary accommodation for 6 years. Now, you can boast about the number of homes you built, But can you explain to her why the Conservatives have allowed that to happen?
I would never boast. I think it's important, however, to stress what it is that we've been doing.
No, I'd like you to explain to our viewer, Shan, why she's been waiting for 6 years for a
Because,
home.
again, I don't know where Sian lives, and do share the details with me so I can make sure that we do everything that we can to help her. More broadly, we need to deliver more homes. I've run through some of the things that we're doing in order to do that. But let me make one important point. Last year, we introduced legislation that would have unlocked 100,000 new homes. Social homes, homes to rent, and homes to buy. When we brought forward that legislation, the opposition voted against it. So if we're looking for culpability and blame, one of the questions we have to ask is why, when we could have had 100,000 additional homes, did Labour vote to stop that? And that's because we have a plan to deal with this very important question, and Labour have no plan at all.
Michael Gove, I think for people listening to you this morning, it's very clear that you acknowledge there's a significant problem with housing in this country. That's very clear. That comes across absolutely clearly. But it's also interesting that you sound almost like, a housing campaigner saying this isn't good enough, that doesn't work over there, yes, the system's broken. When in actual fact, you've been somebody who's been a minister in successive Conservative governments over a period of 14 years, when this situation has got worse and worse and worse. And you even told the Sunday Times in an interview that's been published today, you're worried that if young people don't get the homes they need, they might abandon democracy. Aren't you actually worried if young people don't get the homes they need, they're abandoning the Conservative Party?
No, it's not about party politics. It's about making sure that everyone in this country has a stake in society and that people have a warm, safe and decent home. Let me mention three things very briefly.
No, forgive me. You're speaking to the Sunday Times, you've tried to turn this into an issue of saying, democracy is in jeopardy if we don't do this. You've also just pointed the finger of blame at the opposition. You've been in charge for 14 years. I think some people listening to you this morning might think it's almost shameless to be pointing the finger at others for this.
No, I have mentioned one specific example where we were taking forward proposals. In order for change to be made, we needed the support of Labour. That support was not forthcoming. They need to be held accountable for that, as you're holding me accountable for the last 14 years. And as I mentioned earlier, let's look at the record in context. My approach is always to say we need to do more, we need to do better in every area of government. And I think it's also important that we look at what we have done and ask ourselves, what more can be done in order to do what is required? And it's not just, as Quajo was mentioning earlier, the number of new homes that we need, it's also the quality of homes that we need. So some of the resources that we give to people who provide housing have had to be spent on improving the quality of homes that were built 30, 40, 50 years ago that are now reaching the end of their life. And there are people who are living with damp and mould and horrific conditions. So we've arrived at a moment in history where we need to spend not just on quantity, but on quality as well. And that is an important lesson, because when we were building significant numbers of homes in the 50s and 60s, they were not of the quality required. So that's why I've placed an emphasis on making sure that we improve living conditions as well as delivering more homes.
We're running short of time, but are you confident that the Chancellor will be persuaded to give you more money to spend on housing in the budget in a few weeks' time?
Well, I'm doing everything that I can. Short of laying siege to his own home, every day I send him a note or a message emphasising the importance of doing more to unlock housing supply. And he gets it. So Jeremy Hunt is someone who absolutely appreciates the importance of supporting the next generation. And the critical thing here is all of the progress that we need to make would be put at risk if we had a Labour Party that has no plan for economic growth.
We'll be talking to Labour later in the programme.
Only this week has made another unfunded pledge, which will require tax to increase or borrowing to go up.
We will discuss that with Labour later in the programme. Just before we say goodbye to you, the Foreign Secretary has made plain the government's concern about the Israelis' expected invasion into Rafah, where there are more than 1 million Gazans trapped. Do you echo that concern? What would you say to the Israelis?
I couldn't put things better than the Foreign Secretary has. And I think Simon Schama and your panel explained the nature of the situation. we need to make sure that the people who were taken hostage by Hamas are returned to their families. The events on October the 7th were the worst loss of innocent Jewish life since the Holocaust. It was an horrific pogrom, and my heart grieves for Israel and what it's had to endure. At the same time, while it is absolutely right to deal with that terrorist threat, we know, and again, it's very difficult, we know that the Gazan Palestinian population has been suffering. What we want to see, as the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister have made clear, is a sustainable ceasefire, and that means an opportunity both to ensure that there's an end to Hamas terrorism, but also that the aid and support that the Palestinian people need and deserve can be delivered.
OK, Michael Gove, thank you very much indeed for coming in and talking to us this morning. As ever, let us know what you think. You can email me, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or on X or on Instagram, you can use the hashtag BBC Laura K. We do read all of your messages, so keep them coming. Sometimes you have very good ideas indeed for questions. Let's then, Kwejo, come straight to you. Now, you've been meeting Michael Gove every now and again to talk about housing. He did there give what sounded like a cast iron guarantee that no-fault evictions will be gone by the end of this year.
Well, it's interesting because I was actually going to say earlier on, people are asking, where is this renters reform bill? There's a lot of people, the charities, campaigners, campaign groups asking where it is, because whilst it is being delayed and we're waiting months and months for it to come, people are being evicted from their homes, and we're seeing that. And many of those people will be turning to local authorities. I did have some questions in regards to social housing and building. I mean, last year, for example, we knocked down and sold off 3 times the amount of social homes than we actually constructed and built last year. And that's been a year-on-year trend. We've got 1.4 million people on the current social housing waiting list. We've got 139,000 homeless kids in England. And in fact, in 2022, 2,300 people died whilst waiting on the social housing waiting list. That is how desperate the situation is. And there's a prediction this year that £2 billion will be spent on temporary accommodation. That shows the scale of the issue. And I think actually we will surpass that figure just because of how desperate the situation is.
But do you think he really gets it? Because, I mean, he was saying, well, look, actually, we've got a good record in some areas, but I understand it's a problem. Does that persuade you?
Well, I mean, it's great hearing some of those points, but at the end of the day, we have to remember they have been in government and they are in charge with tackling this crisis. I mean, we didn't even touch upon the issue of right to buy, the fact we are selling off social homes, council homes, when we simply don't have enough as it is to provide, but we're still allowing that to happen. I think any serious politician or government will first and foremost look at the right to buy scheme and think if we are serious about tackling this housing crisis, we will suspend it or change it so we don't continue selling off social homes.
Simon, what did you make of how Michael Gove sort of presents all of this? I mean, listen to Kwejo, this sounds like a real moment of angst for a generation.
Well, my impression, Laura, was that he was running against his own government slightly, but in the most charming and eloquent way. So you have 2 possible oppositions, in the election. You have the notion that if you fess up, really, to did what we can, did better than the others, but we can do better, and then you have the actual opposition running against the election. So I think, listening to Kwejo, I think what has not happened until recently, or maybe I haven't been listening as well as I should, is that we are absolutely at a sort of terrifying point. I mean, 139,000 homeless kids. And we worry constantly every day about a rise in violent crime and sort of worry about the stability and fights breaking out on transport and so on. And it has to be related to people's sense of despair that the old idea that if you buckle down and you pass your exams and upward social mobility, it will be, the prize at the end of it will be the security of a home. And that increasingly is a fantasy about where we are now. So
I think
respectively to what Kwejo said.
I think housing will definitely be a big issue in this election in a way it hasn't actually been for a long time. Victoria, let's then talk about the King. Lots of coverage this morning in the papers about the King's message to the public last night, thanking them for the messages of support since his diagnosis. What's the challenge of trying to cover this while giving a degree of privacy, but to one of the most prominent people in the country?
Actually, I think they've handled it amazingly well this time, the Palace. They gave us loads of information, loads of background information. All the questions that we had, they'd already answered in a special document. And it's interesting how much more open they've been this time than with the Queen. When the Queen went into hospital, they told us nothing. Whereas this time, the King's been very adamant that he wants to be a campaigner. He wants to be an influencer. And I think once he's got through his treatment, he will tell us exactly what it was. And he will see himself as having this amazing platform to do good.
Do you think that's been a deliberate decision then? That's interesting.
Definitely been a deliberate decision. I think he wanted to, I think the reason behind him not saying precisely what type of cancer he has is because he wants to feel inclusive to all cancer sufferers and relatives who've got cancer and so on. So I think we'll see a really different type of king when he comes out the other side, hopefully.
Simon, as a historian, what have you thought watching on to this?
Well, it's been actually very impressive, I have to say. You know, you've teed me up, Laura. You're going to regret doing that. But as a historian, there was this theory in the Middle Ages. OK, are we all ready over breakfast, everyone? That talked about the monarchy being two different kinds of body: the body politic and the body natural, and they were to be kept absolutely separate. And I'm old enough to remember the serious illness. We all knew he was ill of George VI in 1951, 1952. And because actually we were only allowed to know the monarchy in its ceremonial presence as the body politic, we never imagined we'd ever know what was going on with the king's body natural. Now we're at a situation vastly different, where it's possible for the monarchy as an institution to benefit from transparency, even about health, which concerns so many people. And so this is a very impressively understanding. It's an issue for the psychology of the nation. And what Charles has done, what the king has done, I think, is press the affection trigger, which is enormous, about his own very rocky up and down personal history. So as Victoria was saying, the monarchy will come out, I think, the monarchy as an institution will come out stronger for the truth.
Talking, though, of that rocky history, there are still rocky relationships. We know in the royal family, Prince Harry flew in this week and then disappeared very quickly. But he also, Victoria, settled his legal action against the Mirror this week. And the fight between Prince Harry and the newspapers goes on. We know there is also a case against the newspaper group News UK that you're a part of, and we can't get into the legal details. But can you assure our viewers that the kind of practices we've heard about, the kind of practices Prince Harry has complained about, can you assure people that's come to an end? It doesn't happen anymore?
100%. Obviously, as you say, I can't comment on the ongoing cases. But, I've been editor for 4 years now, and I've never covered stories on Prince Harry. It wasn't my bag going back. It goes back a long way, and it's absolutely 100% not what happens today.
Do you think Harry has still got the sort of right to be this cross with how the press behaved if things have changed?
No, I don't. But I think he's also cross with lots of people. He's really cross with the courtiers. He's really cross with his brother. He's really cross with his father. He's angry with the world. And it's a shame that he still bears so much anger despite all that therapy. I personally thought it was brilliant that he flew over to see his father, despite their very difficult relationship. It gives reason to feel optimistic that the two of them can perhaps repair that, which I think our readers certainly want. They want the whole family to be back together. And I thought it was great of Harry that he did what any normal person would have done and jumped straight on the plane, as I did when I got that same call in California that my father had cancer. I jumped on the plane even though he said, don't bother. So well done, Harry, and well done the King for taking the time to see him from his busy schedule. We all know he does not like changing that diary, but they did. So maybe this is a reason for hope.
And Kweja, we're talking a bit this morning about the difference between the generations. Do you think people your age are following this as closely as maybe Simon and Victoria, people my age, have been?
That's an interesting question. I don't think so as closely, although I think everyone is aware regardless of age. And me personally, I lost my dad to cancer a few years ago. And I think for anyone, regardless of where you're from, your background or whatnot, anyone that's been through that process with a family member or it's happened to themselves knows just how much of a difficult time it is. I think with this, what I'd like to see is a spotlight on the poor state of cancer treatment in this country and the fact that there's many people out there who are diagnosed with cancer. I know, luckily, the King is receiving treatment, but for many, they have to wait weeks, if not months, to start cancer treatment. And for some reason, for some people, that can be an absolute death sentence for them. So there has to be emphasis on that off of the back of this news, I think.
And we know also that lots more people have been searching and trying to find out information. Let's talk briefly, Simon, about concern about health conditions across the Atlantic. No one can have missed the stories about President Biden this week and the assessment of whether his memory is really up to scratch. What do you make of all of that, watching on?
Well, it's an extraordinary situation, Laura. That the Biden government, after the horrific fiasco of the exit from Afghanistan and setting aside the real problem of the southern border, which nobody has any idea how to deal with. Other than that, this has been one of the most successful administrations since the war. And the American economy is going gangbusters, highest growth rate, I know I'm sounding like a campaigner, which I'm not, in the G7, lowest unemployment, and inflation down almost below 3%. And yet, Biden's popularity in the tank, as we all know. Why? All sorts of journalists have been dancing around, but it is obviously the age problem. He's been running the government effectively. There's no reason to suppose not. And yet, it is part of a job to be president, to communicate very effectively, to get to the end of your sentences, to remember that Sisi is not the president of Mexico, but the president of Egypt. So now there is an extraordinary kind of, it's called in the American press, hair on fire panic going on about the Democrats, about who is going to say, I saw the phrase, take the car keys away from grandpa, and so this is a very interesting but very, very troubling situation. Never mind about whether he's right to stand. Ought he to be, what is going on in the National Security Council right now? Well, so it is very troubling.
Well, a Biden-Trump rematch might be a very unusual election.
The unhinged versus the well-meaning elderly.
Well,
what a choice.
I'm sure that if they were here or their supporters were here, that they would challenge your descriptions of them. But all three of you, thank you so much for now. Ambition, power and plotting. We are not talking about the Conservatives for once. It's time instead to talk to one of our most famous actors. Voldemort to a generation of kids, M to legions of Bond fans, and now, as one of the most respected actors of his generation, Macbeth. Ray Fiennes is with us in the studio this morning. He's taking on a new performance in Macbeth, not in the plush theatres of the West End, but in warehouses around the country. Have a look at this.
Is this a dagger which I see before me? The handle toward my hand? Come, let me clutch thee.
Well, Ray Fiennes is with us in the studio this morning. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
Now, Macbeth was written and first performed more than 400 years ago. But do you think the story of the tyrant, ruthless ambition and violence has lessons for us now?
I think all Shakespeare's plays have lessons for us now and can connect to a modern audience. Macbeth particularly, I think we're always surrounded and we have present in the world autocratic leaders who use murderous techniques, murderous ways to achieve their ends. And in this production of Macbeth, we set in a modern setting in a war zone. I think we were keen, myself, Simon Godwin, the director, Indira Varma, who plays Lady Macbeth, we wanted it to connect with modern audiences and to provoke a recognition with circumstances in the world today.
And you're performing it in very different circumstances. In these warehouses, in Liverpool, you're in the dockyards, you're in London, you're in the Docklands, out near Canary Wharf. In Edinburgh, you're out big aircraft hangar in
Royal Highland Centre.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
What's the point of doing it there rather than people sitting in a nice comfy red chair?
Well, I've always loved myself going as an audience member to site-specific theatre. It's a bit of an adventure. You go a different way to a place you don't know, and already you're apprehensive and anticipating something different. And I think audiences get in their car, they go somewhere they don't know, a warehouse that they don't know. And the way we've done it with a semi-immersive entrance where you pass a blasted landscape, a war-torn landscape with a burning car and tyres and just rubble from buildings. And I think already that gives them a flavour of the atmosphere we're trying to create.
So you're trying to put people on edge almost?
Yes, put them on edge. We have some of our actors dressed as soldiers moving around and interacting with the audience as they come in, and I think this it builds an intensity of atmosphere and sets up a feeling of the world that we're going to take them into.
You've also insisted, as I understand it, on not having trigger warnings. So some of the things you've just outlined there, some people might nowadays expect there to be a sort of, signposting at the beginning that, you might find some of this a bit tricky. Why did you do that? Have audiences gone too soft?
I think they have. Yes, I think we didn't used to have trigger warnings. I mean, there are very disturbing scenes in Macbeth. There are terrible murders and things. But I think the impact of theatre should be that you're shocked and you should be disturbed. I don't think you should be prepared for these things. And when I was young, we never had trigger warnings for shows.
So would you get rid of them then?
I would, yes, I would. I mean, I think things like strobe effects and things that might affect people physically, they should be notified. But I don't think Shakespeare's plays are full of murders and full of horror. And as a young student and lover of the theatre, I never experienced trigger warnings telling me, don't. By the way, in King Lear, Gloucester's going to have his eyes pulled out. I mean, the shock is, oh my God, this thing is happening.
And that's the experience.
Theatre has to be alive and connect in the present. It's this shock, it's the unexpected. That's what makes an active theatre so exciting.
And talking of active theatre, you know, you do read and hear often people in the industry, even I think the director of the Young Vic stood down at the end of last week, worried about funding, worried about closures, worried about the theatres in our towns and cities around the country really struggling.
Yeah.
Do you worry about that?
In the arts, you mean? Well, yes, I've always, ever since I started out as an actor, there was always this concern that funding for the arts was always an uphill battle. I don't think our national funding for the arts compares with somewhere like France or Germany. It's always been a struggle, and increasingly so. The subsidised theatre is always having to struggle to find sponsorship. So I think, and these are difficult times, as we know, but
What some people have turned to, though, particularly in London's West End, but not exclusively, is bringing in massive name stars.
Yeah.
Sarah Jessica Parker at the moment is on stage in the West End. Incredible scenes of legions of fans outside waiting for her every night.
Yeah.
But would you pay £300 a ticket to go and see Sarah Jessica Parker in a play?
No, the ticket prices are worryingly high at the moment, particularly in the West End. In this setup, what we've tried to do, our producers, Wessex Grove and Underbelly, we have, I think, 20% of our tickets across the board have been at £15 to £20.
So you can do it?
We can do it, yes. And I think at something like 50% of the tickets are around £50. So there are expensive seats for this production, but they're offset by having cheaper seats.
So would you pay £300 to go and see Sarah Jessica Parker?
I have to confess I was invited to the opening night and I got a freebie.
Ah, and was it good?
It was very good, yeah. They are brilliant comic performances.
We will be talking in a few minutes to Labour about their green plans and how they've ditched their £28 billion target. But I know you've also taken to environmental campaigning. You've made a film, a very stark film, about pylons potentially going across a landscape that you love.
Well, actually, no, the film doesn't talk about pylons.
It's the substations, forgive me.
It's the substations, yes.
Bringing electricity from wind farms.
In Suffolk,
Suffolk.
Yes. Well, I have an affinity with Suffolk. I was born there and I've gone back there all my life. And when I learned of this proposal to build a huge energy hub, a super hub inland just near the coastal town of Albury, I was quite shocked by what was being proposed by National Grid and Scottish Power. The thing is that there are better solutions than this, which the Belgians and the Danes and the Dutch are doing, which is to build offshore hubs. So you have your wind farms creating the energy. But in the Suffolk case, what's being proposed is you bring it into a huge, massive superstructure, the size of 90 football pitches, 30 metres high, just inland. And we believe that this will have a devastating negative impact on local communities, farming, fishing, tourism, when it can be done better, which is offshore hubs.
Isn't that, though, and we've asked the National Grid about this, isn't it much more expensive, though, to do it
Yes,
offshore?
but this is a long-term legacy for our country. This is the infrastructure going into the future. It might be more expensive in the short term. In the mid-term, we're convinced it's not. But this is really vital that we get this right. And this is the solution, the implementation of this structure is destructive. And I've been excited to look at what the Belgians and the Danes are doing by these offshore infrastructures, which are then ecologically friendly. And they take their cabling onshore onto brownfield sites, which is critical. This is a greenfield site proposal.
Do you think you're going to win the campaign?
What?
Do you think you'll win the campaign?
We have to keep fighting for it because it's not just about Suffolk. This resonates throughout the country. This is how this country goes forward in building our new clean energy infrastructure. It's really, really vital. And what's been proposed at the moment, we think is a disaster.
Well, That's exactly what we'll be talking about in a minute or two with Pat McFadden from the Labour Party, the green transition with the trade-offs it might bring. But Ray Fiennes, it's been such a thrill to have you in the studio this morning. Well, we'll come back another time and we can continue our conversation. Thank you so much. Now, as we've just been discussing, in the last few weeks, we've been talking time and time again about whether Labour is going to stick to its £28 billion it promised to spend on creating green jobs and moving to cleaner energy. But eventually it became the worst kept secret in Westminster that the party was going to ditch it. And officially they went public this week that the promise of the £28 billion cheque had gone. The explanation for ditching the plan that was meant to get the economy going and go green: there ain't enough cash in the coffers that Labour hopes to control after the next election. Keir Starmer's backing say it's just being pragmatic. They blame the Tories for wrecking the public finances. But others are desperately disappointed and think that they have given up on their ambition. Well, Pat McFadden is Labour's campaign coordinator, the campaign chief, and you're back with us in the studio this morning. Now, it's been written that you were one of the people who wasn't too fond of this big price tag, so you won the argument. Are you pleased?
I've read a lot of that. It's not about me. This is a decision taken by Keir Starmer and taken for good reasons. When this policy was announced a couple of years ago, interest rates were at 0.1%. They're now at 5.25%. Anyone viewing this programme who's had to remortgage in the last couple of years will know what that has meant for their finances. Now, the parallel between household finances and a country's finances doesn't always hold. I wouldn't always use this comparison. But when you look at the country's public finances, what that change in interest rates has meant is it's costing £70 billion more now to service our national debt than when the policy was first announced. So we've got a duty in the approach to the election to make sure that what we announce is deliverable, and that change in circumstances, some of which was caused by the Liz Truss mini-budget, is part of the picture.
The thing is that, Pat McFadden, that change in circumstances really happened many months ago now. And actually, it was only last week that Keir Starmer was saying the £28 billion was absolutely vital. So actually, you've been hanging on to it for too long? Or were you misleading us that you decided ages ago you were going to ditch it but didn't want to come clean?
Look, you can debate the timing. Should it have happened a couple of months
ago? I'm asking you a question.
Should it have happened after the budget? I don't think it's a secret that we've been looking at this for some time, as we've a duty to do, because this is the election year. An election could happen any time. We're in the approach to this. And the other thing about it was, all the discussion, you've had many of my colleagues sitting here in recent weeks, and you've probably asked them about this 28 billion. The policy, the focus of the policy had become entirely about a public borrowing figure. And what was getting lost in that endless discussion about the borrowing figure was the good things that need to be done through the green transition.
But
we've managed to keep a lot of those in the announcement we made.
But by ditching the figure, which you chose to put out there, it's not other people who decided to talk about 28 billion. It was the Labour Party who decided to talk about the 28 billion. And by ditching it, some of our viewers are really worried that you're actually abandoning your ambitions on this. Let's get a question from Sylvia Walker, one of our viewers. She's said, Labour has just lost my vote. We British mostly love our wildlife and our fragile earth. Who of our politicians gives a toss? You've lost votes because of this.
Look, what I'd say to Sylvia and to anybody else who takes that view is they could be forgiven for thinking in some of the coverage of recent days that somehow we had abandoned ambitions to make a real success of this green transition. That's not the case. Let me tell you what's still there. We've still got a commitment to GB Energy, a publicly owned energy company, to help drive the transition to clean power. We've still got a commitment to a national wealth fund to preserve our steel industry, invest in our ports, the important industries that will be needed to support the green transition. We've still got a commitment to local power plans where people can have incentives to have renewable energy in their local areas. We've still got a commitment to insulate millions of homes. There are good things that are still part of this plan. They'll now be financed in a different way with a combination of windfall tax and public borrowing.
And we'll come to that in a second, but the reality is that you have significantly cut the amount of money that you're prepared to spend to do those things that you say are the good things you still want to do. And that does matter. You can't sit here and say, oh, it doesn't make a difference whether it's 28 billion or 4 billion. And as you mentioned, this was also your plan to grow the economy. This is how Keir Starmer sat in that chair and told our viewers, we're going to spend this because that's what will get our economy growing. There's a quote from the plan says, this is the vehicle through which we will turn Britain's economy around. So without that vehicle going at full tilt with the full funding, why should anyone believe you can turn the economy around?
Can I make 2 points in response to that? The first point is we've made I think, an error sometimes in the Labour Party on judging the worth of every policy as the amount of public money spent on it. Let me give you an example from our time in government. We came into government 25 years ago with a very modest pledge to reduce class sizes. But we then were able to have a transformation on education on the back of a modest pledge.
So it was a mistake to obsess about a figure.
It is a mistake to obsess about a figure. The other point here, which is really important, if I may, is that in this area, even more than education or health, the green transition will be largely driven by private sector investment. And in the focus on the borrowing figure, we had lost some sight of that. Let me give you an example.
So was it a mistake then to promise a figure in the first place?
Look, I think it was an important signal of intent at a time of a different economic environment with zero interest rates. But it's important that your viewers understand this. In the transition to clean power, right now, there are some £200 billion of projects in the investment pipeline. That is private money. And in the focus purely on 28 billion, we had lost sight of the fact that most of this transition, not just in the UK and around the world, it will be private investment that drives it. What's got to happen here...
The case that you've always made is that the public sector sort of has to go first. You have to create the conditions, and you have significantly changed your tack on this. And I'd like to read our viewers, someone who'd been involved in these discussions. A couple of weeks ago, I asked them whether they were going to ditch the figure, and this is what they said. I think the idea the party will give up on its growth plan in March is not plausible. Keir has 5 missions. It's impossible to achieve 2 of them without this plan. So I'll ask you again, how will you grow the economy when you've ditched the way that you were going to do it?
Look, you're right to say the public sector and the government has to step up to the plate. And we will still do that through GB Energy, which is financed through this plan, through a National Wealth Fund, which is financed through this plan, through the kind of things I listed a moment ago. But the way to make this a success is for public and private to work together on it. That's what's got to happen here and in every other country around the world.
And on the private sector, part of how you're now funding this is by extending your windfall tax till 2029. Offshore Energy UK, who represents lots of companies, including some in the vital North Sea industry around Aberdeen and Scotland, have said extending the windfall tax will compound the turbocharging of North Sea decline. They're desperately worried this will mean that jobs go in the North Sea. And actually, you're punishing some businesses by doing that.
Look, I don't think the oil and gas industry has been fond of the idea of a windfall tax from the get-go. But with the big increase in prices that we've seen in recent years, we think it's fair to get the proceeds from some of that to use for the green transition. And the level that we will be taxing through this windfall tax is the same level that Norway is doing and has done for many years.
You think it's worth it if there's a cost to people in North Sea businesses?
Look, I don't put it like that. I say this is the same as what Norway is doing at the level of it. And we think it's right to have a combination of that and public borrowing to finance this. But the point I really want to stress today is that the green transition cannot and should not just be judged by a public borrowing level. It should be judged by public and private sectors working together, and the lion's share of the investment for this will come from the private sector if they know that they have a government that will step up to the plate and is committed to it. And I assure you, with us, they will.
OK, let's talk briefly about the Post Office, because you were one of the people who was Post Office Minister for a time, and our viewers well know the horror of some of the things that have been revealed about what was going on in the Post Office and how sub-postmasters and mistresses were treated. Now, you were asked whether you had concerns at the time recently, and you said that you couldn't really remember, it hadn't really come across your desk. Have you gone back and
yes,
had a
I've
look?
Gone back.
You have?
I've looked at the papers as any minister can do, and it did cross my desk. Several MPs asked parliamentary questions or wrote letters, and what I found looking at those papers after 14 years away from the department was just how emphatic the Post Office was about this. The way that this worked, the Post Office was operationally independent from the department. It was publicly owned, but on a day-to-day basis, it was run by its own management, had a chief executive and a board and so on. And each time an MP raised a question about this, the reply would come back from the Post Office that they thought the system was robust. They had no evidence to suggest there was anything wrong with Horizon. In fact, I read a letter from the chief executive at the time to one of the MPs saying, if there's any problems, they're resolved at no detriment to the individual.
So as far as you were concerned, the Post Office was telling you it was fine, and you didn't make further inquiries at the time. Do you wish you had?
Look, of course I do, given what happened, and the human tragedy of this is awful. Look, I think there were two problems here that came together. One was blind faith in the IT from the Post Office, and the second was a culture of prosecution of their own sub-postmasters, and those two things came together with the most awful human consequences.
Okay, just finally, I want to ask you about reports this morning that the Labour candidate for the Rochdale by-election, Azhar Ali, has claimed that Israel knew about the attack on October the 7th and let it happen to give them a great green light to do what they want in Gaza. Now, he has since apologised for his comments, but does someone like that with those views have a place in Keir Starmer's Labour Party?
What he said was completely wrong. I was appalled when I saw it. It's quite right that he apologised and completely retracted, and I hope he learns a lesson from it.
Should he still be a Labour candidate?
Well, he's given a full apology and a full retraction, but those comments were completely wrong, and they certainly don't represent the Labour Party's view.
OK, Pat McFadden, thank you very much for being with us in the studio this morning. It's always great to have you here. Now, later today, a vigil will be held in Warrington to mark a year since the murder of Brianna Ghey by two other teenagers. Last week, we were privileged to be joined by her mother here in the studio, Esther Ghey, who opened up about her experiences, and she told us about her campaign for social media safety. But we were overwhelmed by your response, so we wanted to share some of your thoughts. Barbara Foley told us what an amazing woman Esther is. I cannot imagine her pain, and I'm in awe of her strength. Jenny from Bristol wanted to pass on her thanks to Esther as a voice on behalf of the millions of parents worldwide who are struggling. She said it's tragic that it should take a mother's grief to get politicians to listen. Karen Barnes said, why are schools waiting for legislation? Surely they should have a policy in place now of no mobile phones in school. Until the tech companies and government come up with a more robust way to protect them, the less time children spend on social media, the better. But it's not easy. Brian Kirk said, how can you ban social media for under 16s? A law would be unenforceable. Certainly ban phones in school. We know that this issue is really important to you, and we will come back to it soon. Right, let's have a final word with our panel about some of the things we've been talking about, whether it's the travails of trying to manage the world online with its risks and dangers, whether it's not being able to buy a house, whether it is what's happening with the environment. Kwejo, there are a lot of things that some people believe make it a lot harder now if you're starting out, a lot harder for younger generations, and that politicians don't really respond adequately. I mean, what do you think of that? I think that's right. Do you sense there's a real mood among people your generation?
Well, absolutely. And what's interesting is politicians of both sides will turn around and ask, oh, how do we engage young people? Or why aren't young people voting? Well, what are you offering them? I mean, we've seen for many, many years and many, many elections where young people aren't the priority, but they are overwhelmingly suffering now, whether it's in relation to housing or work, jobs, education, the cost of education, yet there's no real benefit they're being offered by either party.
And what about Labour's green plans then? Do you think that people have noticed, the people that have noticed this £28 billion price tag and then the whole wobbling around it, and then now it's been ditched?
Yeah, I do, and I think young people are very much in tune with the social issues that we face, especially around climate change. It's interesting, I think there's two sides to this coin. With the Green Pledge, obviously, Keir Starmer wants to be seen as being pragmatic. He wants to be seen as someone that's steadying the ship. He has said himself he doesn't want to divert away from his fiscal rules, and everything within the manifesto has to be accounted for. So I get that. Having said that, on the flip side of that, this issue of climate change is the biggest issue this country faces, and not just the country, but globally too. And he's sort of backed away from that. I mean, what people want is a leader, someone that's willing to take radical change. What they don't want as the next Prime Minister is a flip-flop, I have to say. And there are going to be people out there worrying, not just climate campaigners, but also campaigners across the board, myself included, who is worrying now in regards to their commitments, even in regards to housing. Are they, in the lead up to the election or after the election, going to pull back from that? But
that's interesting. So as a campaigner, and you speak to Labour now, you think, well, I'm not that sure they might stick to what they've said.
Well, there's question marks being raised, I think.
Victoria, what do you make of the flip-flop, Quajo called it? I mean, you know, Labour does have this dilemma, and it was fascinating to hear Pat McFadden say repeatedly the private sector and the public sector have to work together. I mean, anyone would imagine there's still a tension in the Labour Party like there was between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown over
100%.
public and private.
That's right. It's clear that Rachel Reeves won on this occasion, and I think the big question the public will be asking is, what does Keir Starmer stand for? Who is he? What is his plan? Because we're now not quite sure. I don't think the public mind U-turns if they think they're the right decisions made in the best interests. But it was their big flagship policy. So I'm not clear now what is it they are offering the voters, and that's what our readers will be looking at when they decide.
Do you see that split as well in the generations?
I'm not sure that's true, actually. I think people will respect U-turns if it's for the right reason, whether they're young or old. But on this particular issue, I think Labour have got a problem in that it was their flagship thing, and now we're not sure who they are.
Simon, what did you make of the decision?
Well, I tell you, Laura, I think elections are profound moments in the history of a country. They go beyond, I think particularly since the Conservatives have been in power for so long, they've gone beyond which comes out on top, which political party. They're a moment where the country has a chance to say, who are we? Where are we going? What is Britain's future? And I, like Quajo and Victoria, I understand the anxiety in the Labour Party leadership to take a cause away from the Conservatives, say we are responsible. But ultimately, if you think back to, well, if you think about Tony Blair, his sense actually that he had a vision, that he could promise a distinctively new Britain was fundamentally important. And just rhetorically and psychologically, it is extremely important for Labour to say, we understand what the British future should be like and how we're going to get there, and actually to make an issue is we are giving the young people of Britain, under stress, as Quajo has very eloquently put it, their future back. That's what they have to do, really, to win.
Well, that is one of their slogans, talking about Britain getting their future back. But are they doing that now? That rhetoric, that sense of vision? Quajo, final word to you.
There's a lot more that has to happen, I think, fundamentally, and there has to be a lot more radical proposals, especially in relation to housing. That's the number one thing, I think, problem that the country is facing outside of all the climate crisis, housing, and housing for young people, especially those renting. They need the support, and right now they do not have it. OK, well, it's been great actually to have a chance to talk a lot about housing and renting this morning. It's been great to have all of you through with us. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. Huge thanks to you, of course, for watching at home on a day when we started by asking if the big political parties are listening hard enough to the younger generations, whether it's on housing, whether it's on climate change, or maybe whether it's paying less tax. When you're starting out, the temptation for all politicians, especially when they're under the cosh, is to make a quick decision for the short term and to appeal to voters they're sure are going to turn out to cast a ballot. That is, I'm afraid, the older among us. It might be politically logical, but maybe it leaves a big chunk of our society with a legitimate complaint that their needs aren't always at the top of the list. You can always catch up on the iPlayer. I'll be with Paddy O'Connell in a few minutes for this Sunday's newscast. You can find that later on BBC Sounds. And I will look forward to seeing you next Sunday, same time, same place.